My own son. Sold my kidney. And I didn't even see it coming. I thought I raised him right, but greed had already poisoned his heart. If you ever think you know your family, think again. I still remember the day as if it had been etched into the very fibers of my heart. The day I first realized that everything I had believed about my son, Asher, was nothing but a fragile illusion. A mask he wore to hide the darkness that had been growing inside him. The same darkness I had failed to notice because I was too busy working double shifts. Too busy making sure our small house on Marlowe Street was warm. Too busy hoping that my love alone could protect him from the harshness of the world. Yet, in the end, love alone was not enough. And the betrayal came like a cold wind ripping through the soul. Sudden and merciless, as I was sitting in the little kitchen. The one with the chipped yellow tiles and the faded floral curtains. Sipping lukewarm tea, trying to remember why life had suddenly felt so heavy. And then the phone rang, and it was Detective Marla Gaines on the line. Her voice grave, almost hesitant. The kind of voice that makes a person's stomach turn to leave before any words are even spoken. And she said, "Mrs. Lennox, there's been an incident involving your son." And just like that, the room seemed to spin. And I gripped the edge of the counter so hard that my knuckles turned white. And I barely heard the rest of her words because my mind refused to process them. The words floating around in a haze until finally the devastating clarity hit me. Asher had sold my kidney, my own body, my life, for a few $1,000s. The same kidney that had kept me alive all these years. The one that had survived every illness, every night of pain, every surgery, every scare. And now it was gone, bartered like a commodity, as if I were just another object he could trade. And I remember sitting there, trembling, the tea forgotten, the heat from it burning my fingers unnoticed, tears blurring my vision. And all I could think of was how I'd raised him, how I had spent sleepless nights nursing him through fevers. How I had worked extra shifts to buy him the sneakers he wanted, the books he loved. And now, everything was meaningless because the boy I loved had been replaced by a stranger, someone with sharp eyes and a cold, calculating heart that I had failed to see. And it wasn't just betrayal. It was a theft of trust, a theft of my body, a theft of everything I had ever believed about family. And as the days passed, the truth unfolded like a wound that refused to heal. My son had been desperate, yes, desperate for money, caught up with the wrong crowd, enticed by whispers of quick riches. The kind of promises that sound golden but are actually laced with venom. And I remember hearing the way he spoke on the phone that night, his voice low, almost rehearsed, trying to cover the guilt that was already written in his trembling words. Trying to convince himself, that what he had done was necessary, that it was for survival, that the world had left him no choice. But I could see through it. I could feel the lie in the pit of my soul, because love doesn't hurt like this. And a mother doesn't forgive a theft of life, even when it comes from her own child. And the hospital visits that followed were surreal, the sterile smell, the cold floors. The antiseptic scent mingling with my own nausea as I saw the paperwork, saw the signatures, saw the finality of what had been done without my consent. And the doctors, sympathetic but bound by law, could only offer sterile apologies, their eyes polite but distant, while I sat there, powerless, wondering how a boy I had held as a baby, a boy I had whispered lullabies to in the dead of night, could become the person who had sold me out so early. And the neighbors, when they found out, whispered behind their hands, some shaking their heads, others pitying me. And I couldn't face them, couldn't face the world, because everywhere I turned, there was the echo of his betrayal, the shadow of that day. And I remember nights spent awake, staring at the ceiling, clutching my side, imagining the kidney that was gone, imagining the man I had called my son, wondering where he was, what he was doing, whether he felt even a fraction of the anguish he had caused. And I realized then that the wound was not just physical. It was spiritual, emotional, existential. The kind of pain that seeps into the bones and refuses to leave. And yet, amidst the heartbreak, there were moments I could not suppress. Flashes of memory that made it worse. The first time he smiled at me. The day he learned to ride a bicycle without training wheels. The way he used to curl up next to me during thunderstorms. The way his laughter used to fill the rooms of our little home. And all of it was poison now. Tainted by the knowledge that beneath that smile and laughter had been a calculating mind ready to betray the one person who had never wronged him. And when I confronted him, when I finally found him hiding in that dingy apartment above a shuttered store, he looked at me with wide eyes, not remorse, not sorrow, but fear. Fear that I would never forgive him. Fear that the love he had taken for granted could turn into something cold and unforgiving. And in that instant, I saw both the child I once knew and the stranger he had become. Two halves of the same person, twisted into a cruel paradox. And I wept, not just for what he had done, but for the innocence lost, for the mother-son bond shattered, for the life that would never be the same. And as I walked away that night, leaving him to sit in his guilt and fear, I whispered to myself, I will survive. I have survived worse, but this will haunt me forever. And yet, even as I said it, I knew deep down that the story was far from over. Because greed has a way of circling back. Because karma does not sleep. Because Ash's choices would ripple into the lives of everyone around him. And I also knew, with a cold certainty, that my heart could not bear to remain silent. Could not allow this betrayal to be buried in shame. And so I began to tell my story to anyone who would listen. To the empty walls of my home at first. To friends who asked why I'd grown so quiet. To strangers who found me sitting alone on the park bench, my hands folded in my lap. My eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the horizon, recounting the horror. Recounting the love and the loss and the unbearable sting of betrayal. And the more I told it, the more I realized that speaking the truth was the only way to keep myself alive. Because inside me, I carried not just the pain of losing a kidney, but the pain of realizing that even love is not enough to shield us from the human capacity for selfishness. And as the nights wore on, as the cold wind whispered through the cracked windows of my little home, I promised myself that I would tell everything, every secret, every wound, every quiet scream, because if I did not, I would be complicit in hiding the truth. And perhaps, just perhaps, in sharing it, I could prevent another mother from experiencing the same heartbreak. And yet, as I prepared to speak again, to recount every detail, I felt a tremor of fear. Because what I was about to reveal was more than just betrayal, it was the unraveling of everything I had held dear. The collapse of the life I had painstakingly built. And I realized that even now, years later, the pain is not dulled. It is only deepened, like a river carving through stone. Unstoppable and permanent. And so, with tears in my eyes, I sit here today, speaking to you as the woman who trusted too much. Who loved too much, and who was repaid with the unimaginable. And I leave you with this, sometimes the people we love the most are the ones who can hurt us the deepest. And sometimes, survival means telling the world your story, no matter how unbearable it may be, because the truth, once unleashed, is the only thing that can set us free. And yet, even as I speak these words, I hear a knock at the door, a shadow at the window, and a whisper of something yet to come. Because this story is far from over, and the question that haunts me, the question that will not let me rest, is this: will Asher ever realize what he has done? Or will he disappear into the shadows of his greed, leaving me alone with the echoes of a betrayal that can never be undone? And just when I thought I had seen the worst, what I discovered next made my heart shatter all over again. I remember the days after that phone call as if I had been living underwater. Every sound muffled, every movement sluggish. The world reduced to a haze of sorrow and disbelief. My body aching not just from the surgery that had stolen my kidney, but from the relentless weight of betrayal that pressed down on my chest like an unyielding stone. And even as I moved through the motions of daily life, preparing my meager meals, folding laundry, watering the little garden patch out back, I felt as if I were a ghost, drifting through rooms that once held laughter and warmth, now haunted by the memory of the son I had lost to greed. And the neighbours, once friendly, now avoided eye contact, whispering behind their hands as if my misfortune were contagious. And I couldn't blame them, because shame is a heavy cloak, and it clung to me like a second skin. Yet there were moments I couldn't escape from, moments that clutched at my soul and would not let go. The memory of Asha's last words before disappearing with the man who orchestrated the deal. A whispered apology that rang hollow, a plea that sounded more like a rehearsed line than a confession. And I realized then that his heart had hardened long before that day, that the boy I had raised had been replaced by someone I could no longer recognize, someone willing to barter his mother's body for a few fleeting dollars. And I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, tracing the cracks as if searching for answers in their jagged lines, wondering if I had failed him as a mother, if love alone was not enough to shield a child from temptation. And yet, deep down, I knew that no amount of love could excuse the choices he had made, the decisions that had turned our home into a tomb of broken trust. And I thought of my husband, Henry, long gone, who had always said that character is forged in fire. And I realized that I had watched the fire consume my son without even noticing, blind to the subtle shifts in his demeanor, the quick flashes of anger, the secretive phone calls, the way he had begun to lie with a casual ease that I should have recognized. But I had been too trusting, too wrapped up in survival, too willing to believe in the goodness of the child I had held in my arms. And the guilt of that blindness weighed on me as heavily as the loss of my kidney. Because it was not just my body that had been taken, it was my sense of safety, my belief in the innocence of the person I loved most. And I carried that wound everywhere, in the quiet moments, in the conversations I avoided, in the nights when the darkness pressed close and whispered reminders of what had been done. And yet, even amidst the despair, there was an unrelenting urge to understand, to piece together the chain of events that had led to this betrayal, to trace Asha's steps from the moment he first succumbed to temptation to the final act of selling my kidney. And as I investigated quietly, speaking with friends who had noticed his descent, following threads that led to shadowy figures and murky deals, I discovered a world I had never imagined existed. A world of desperation and greed so raw that it made my son's actions almost comprehensible, almost forgivable in a cold, rational sense, though never in the heart. And I realized that he had been trapped, ensnared by forces larger than his own weakness, yet still accountable for the choices he made. And that duality tortured me, anger and pity intermingling in a relentless storm, leaving me hollowed out, fragile, yet unwilling to break, because somewhere deep inside, the mother in me still hoped for redemption, for a glimmer of the boy I had loved to emerge from beneath the layers of greed and fear. And I would see him sometimes, in fleeting moments, in his hesitant glance or the way his hand trembled when he tried to make excuses. And I would wonder if he felt the weight of what he had done, if he realized that the wound he inflicted could never fully heal. Not just on my body, but on my spirit, on the very fabric of our lives. And the hospital bills, the legal threats, the endless bureaucratic hurdles piled up around me, each one a reminder that the world had not been kind, that survival often demands cruelty. And I was left alone to navigate it all, to carry the scars in silence. Because telling the world what had happened invited pity I did not want, and judgment I could barely endure. And yet, the isolation became a crucible, forcing me to confront my pain, to speak it aloud even when my voice shook, even when tears blurred my words, because only by naming it could I begin to reclaim a fragment of power that had been stolen along with my kidney. And I began to write, to document every detail, every whisper of betrayal, every flash of memory that seared my soul. The notes piling up in tattered notebooks, some pages stained with tears, some margins filled with questions that had no answers. And through the act of writing, I found a strange solace, a tiny ember of control in a life that had been upended. And as I wrote, I thought of Asher again, wondering where he was, what he was thinking, whether he could feel even a fraction of the devastation he had caused. And I imagined confronting him once more, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with the unbearable weight of truth, the quiet, inexorable truth of a mother's heartbreak that does not end, that does not forgive, that simply endures. And the thought of that confrontation, of standing before him and seeing the shock, the fear, the flicker of regret in his eyes, became both a torment and a fragile hope. Because even now, after all that had happened, I could not stop loving him entirely, could not stop hoping that somewhere beneath the lies and greed, the boy I had known still existed, and it was that hope that kept me going through the endless nights, the lonely mornings, the whispering shadows of our once happy home. And then came the letter, small and inconspicuous, slipped under my door one rainy evening, bearing no return address, no name, only the words, "I know what you're feeling. He'll pay." And the paper trembled in my hands as if it carried the weight of fate itself. And in that moment, I realized the story was far from over, that the betrayal was only the beginning, that the journey through grief, anger, and unimaginable loss would lead to truths I was not prepared for. Truths that could either destroy me completely or give me the strength to rise from the ashes of my broken trust. And as I read those words again, I felt a cold thrill of anticipation mixed with dread. Because the next steps were unknown, because I had been pushed into a world where love and betrayal intersected in ways no one should endure. And I knew then, with a certainty that made my chest tighten, that I had to continue, had to follow the trail, had to confront not only Asher but the forces that had ensnared him. And I whispered into the quiet of the room, "I will not be broken. I will not be silent. And you, Asher, you will face what you have done." And in that vow, shaky yet unyielding, I felt the first spark of resilience, the fragile light that promised that even in the darkest betrayal, a mother's voice could rise, unyielding, unstoppable. And the story, my story, was only beginning. But just when I thought I could endure no more, a secret from Asher's past surfaced, one that would change everything I believed about him. And about myself. I thought I had survived the worst betrayal. But I was wrong. What I uncovered about my own son left me speechless and terrified. No mother should ever hear what I heard next. Just when I thought the nightmare of Asher selling my kidney was the deepest cut I would ever endure, life, with its cruel sense of timing, decided to shove a new revelation into my trembling hands. A revelation that came one drizzly afternoon when the postman delivered a thick envelope with no return address. Only my name scrawled in jagged handwriting, and inside, I found a collection of photographs, documents, and bank statements that immediately set my heart pounding with both fear and grim curiosity. Because even after everything, I needed answers. I needed to know why the boy I had raised, the boy who had once clutched my hand and whispered that he loved me, had turned into someone capable of such unimaginable betrayal. And as I spread the papers across my dining table, my fingers shaking so badly that the ink smudged beneath my touch, the truth began to take shape like a shadow stretching over my entire life, revealing not only the depth of Asher's desperation, but also a secret he had carried for years. A secret that explained the subtle changes in his personality I had previously dismissed as teenage rebellion or typical mood swings. The secret of debts I had never known existed. Loans taken from shadowy figures with names I could barely pronounce. Debts that were enormous. Debts that carried threats, violence, and a kind of danger I had only ever seen in movies. Yet here it was, encroaching on my family in the most terrifying, real way imaginable. And I realized that Asher's decision to sell my kidney was not just greed, it was fear. Fear that had metastasized into desperation, so consuming that he had blinded himself to the consequences. And the more I pieced together, the more I understood the intricate web that had ensnared him, connecting him to people I would never willingly meet. People whose eyes were hard and cold, whose words were sharper than knives, and whose influence had begun to shape my son in ways I could barely recognize. The boy who had once brought me flowers from the garden, the boy who had whispered secrets under the covers at night, had been transformed into someone whose survival instincts overrode every moral boundary. And as I pored over each document, each image, each ledger filled with numbers, names, and transactions that made no sense to my untrained eyes, I felt a mix of grief, fear, and, strangely, a grim understanding. Because now the picture was clear. Asher had not acted entirely alone, and the forces around him were larger, more terrifying than I had imagined. And I knew then that confronting him would be only the first step in a journey fraught with danger and emotional upheaval. Yet I had no choice, because the mother in me could not allow this to continue, could not allow the people who had manipulated him to go unchallenged. And so I began tracing his steps, retracing the calls he had made, the addresses he had visited, the names he had whispered in half-fearful conversations. And what I discovered left me trembling in ways I had never felt before. One of the men involved, a man named Kieran Slate, someone I had never heard of before, had been pressuring Asher for months, demanding impossible sums, threatening harm not just to him but to me. And the deeper I dug, the more I realized the world Asher had entered was merciless. A labyrinth of violence, manipulation, and exploitation. And I felt an icy terror as I imagined him navigating it alone, struggling, failing, and ultimately betraying the one person who had always been his safe harbor, me. His mother, the woman who had given him everything. And I could not suppress the anger that flared up. A searing, consuming flame that burned through the fear. Because while I understood the fear, I could not condone the betrayal, and that duality tore at my heart, leaving me raw, fragile, yet determined. Because love does not mean submission, even when it is tested in the most unimaginable ways. And so I made a choice. A decision that would propel me into the darkest corners of Asher's life. Places I had never wanted to go, because survival, truth, and justice demanded that I confront not only him but the shadows that had ensnared him. And the first step was tracking him down, finding him in the cramped apartment above a shuttered convenience store. The air heavy with cigarette smoke and the faint, acrid scent of fear. And when he saw me standing in the doorway, soaked from the rain, my coat clinging to me, my eyes burning with a mix of grief and fury, he froze, the phone in his hand trembling. And for a long moment, neither of us spoke, because the silence itself was a punishment, a reminder of the chasm that now lay between us. And I finally whispered, "We need to talk, now," and he looked away, guilt and panic flickering across his face. The boy I had known hidden beneath layers of fear. And as we sat across from each other in that cramped, dimly lit room, I began to unravel the story he had never told me, the story of coercion, threats, and the impossible decisions that had led him to betray his own mother. And with each word he spoke, tears blurred my vision. And I realized something that terrified me. While he was a betrayer, he was also a victim, caught in a machinery of greed and menace that I had never imagined. And the realization hit me like a hammer. Anger alone would not suffice. I had to navigate this maze carefully, lest I lose him entirely. Or worse, put both of us in danger. And as I listened, I also discovered secrets about his associates. Kieran's network, the hidden transactions, the ominous warnings, the late-night messages, the coded language in emails that threatened more than money, it threatened life itself. And suddenly, the situation escalated from personal heartbreak to life-threatening danger. And I knew that I could no longer just mourn the loss of my kidney and the betrayal of my son. I had to act, to plan, to survive, to reclaim what had been stolen. And in the midst of this chaos, I found a strange clarity, a sense of purpose that rose from the ashes of grief. Because the mother in me, the woman who had endured countless trials, would not allow evil to triumph. And as we strategized quietly, cautiously, whispering in corners, making plans that balanced safety and retribution, I could see glimpses of the boy I had once known, the flicker of remorse, the tentative hope that he might find a path back to morality. And yet, the journey ahead was perilous, filled with unexpected turns, hidden threats, and the constant reminder that one wrong move could destroy everything. And as we mapped the connections, the debts, the threats, the unseen chains that had bound him, I felt my resolve harden, my spirit sharpen, because I had survived betrayal before. And I could survive this, but I also knew that to truly heal, to reclaim both my body and my dignity, I would have to face horrors that most people could not imagine, confront men who saw fear as weakness, and navigate a world I had only glimpsed in nightmares. And through it all, I whispered to myself, to Asher, to the universe, we will survive, we will endure, and justice, in whatever form it can take, will be ours. And even as that vow left my lips, I knew that the coming days would test every fibre of my being, would stretch the bonds between mother and son to breaking, and would reveal truths that were more devastating than the initial betrayal. And as night fell, the rain tapping against the grimy windows, I felt both fear and determination intertwine in my chest, because the story, our story, was far from over, and the next step, the one that would change everything, was waiting just beyond the darkness, ready to either shatter us completely or lead us into a fragile, hard-earned redemption. And then, as I was poring over one of the ledgers, I noticed a small photograph tucked in between the pages, a photograph of a young boy, maybe 10 or 11, standing beside a woman I did not recognize, her face partially obscured by shadows. And something in the way the boy clutched her hand, the way he looked both scared and defiant, made my heart stop. Because I realized with a cold jolt that this boy was Asher, and the woman she was part of the story I had never been told. A part of his past that had shaped him into the man who could betray his own mother. And as I traced the image with my trembling fingers, I felt a surge of both dread and curiosity. Because now I knew that the secrets of Asher's childhood held the key to understanding everything. The moments that had twisted innocence into desperation. The choices forced upon him that had planted the seeds of fear and cunning that would later drive him to commit the unthinkable. And I resolved that I would uncover every detail, every hidden truth. Even if it meant confronting people from his past who would rather see me disappear than speak. Because knowing was the only way forward. And as I sat there, notebook in hand, heart pounding, the storm outside lashing at the windows, I whispered again, no matter what it takes, I will find the truth. And I will face it, for both of us. And then, buried in Asher's past, I found a secret so shocking, so unimaginable. It made me question everything I thought I knew about him and about myself. I thought I knew my son, but what I discovered changed everything. A secret from his childhood left me speechless and terrified. No mother should ever uncover what I found about her own child. As I continued sifting through Asher's past, piecing together the fragments of his childhood that had been hidden from me, I stumbled upon a folder tucked between the ledgers, worn at the edges, yellowed with age, filled with letters, photographs, and documents that had apparently been preserved for years. And as I began to unfold them, my hands trembling and my breath quickening, I realized with a growing sense of horror that there was more to my son than I had ever imagined. More than the betrayal of my kidney, more than the desperate choices he had made as a young man. Because these documents told the story of a child caught in situations no child should ever endure. And I saw him, a small boy with wide eyes and a solemn face, Standing in photographs beside strangers whose expressions were harsh, whose hands were rough, and whose eyes held a mixture of anger, indifference, and danger. And as I read the letters, written in hurried, sometimes scrawled handwriting, I began to piece together the truth. When Asher was 8 years old, his father, Henry, who had passed away years before, had been struggling with addiction and debt. And during that tumultuous period, a woman named Elara Whitman, a figure I had never encountered, but whose influence had shaped my son's early life, had taken him in under the guise of helping, offering shelter and food, promising guidance and stability. Yet the reality was far darker, a labyrinth of manipulation, coercion, and subtle threats that had forced a small, trusting child into situations that no child should ever face. And the letters revealed arrangements, small at first, a favor here, a task there, but escalating, demanding obedience, secrecy, and a kind of compliance that planted the seeds of fear and survival in the core of his being. And as I read, I felt both rage and sorrow swelling in my chest. The rage at the people who had exploited my son, and the sorrow at realizing that the choices he had made later, the desperate acts, the betrayal of his own mother, were rooted in this early trauma, this crushing weight of fear and obligation that I had been oblivious to, because I had been struggling to hold our home together, to provide, to survive. And I had not known that while I thought I was protecting him, there were forces already bending his world, shaping him into someone who would do whatever it took to survive. And the photographs, too, told a story of isolation, of moments when Asher had been forced to hide, to watch, to obey adults whose morality was absent, whose desire for control had superseded any notion of kindness. And as I traced each photograph with my fingers, I could feel the echo of that fear in my bones. The echoes of a child learning that life could be cruel, that trust was fragile, and that survival often required acts that would later haunt him. And the letters detailed encounters with men whose names I had seen in the ledgers, the same shadowy figures now demanding money, now orchestrating the events that led to my kidney being sold. And suddenly everything aligned, the chain of desperation, fear, manipulation, and betrayal, from childhood into adulthood. And I realized that Asher's actions were not just rebellion or greed, they were the culmination of years of coercion, of learning that to survive, he had to lie, deceive, and sometimes hurt the ones he loved most. And this realization tore at my heart with a mixture of grief and helplessness. Because while I had felt rage and betrayal at losing my kidney, I had not yet understood the roots of the man my son had become, the boy he had once been, broken and molded by circumstances beyond my control. And as I read further, I discovered something more shocking. One letter, folded carefully and addressed to me in handwriting I did not recognize, detailed a promise Elara had made to Asher, that if he obeyed, if he did what was necessary to survive, she would ensure we would never be harmed, that our family could remain intact. And the weight of that revelation hit me like a physical blow, because it meant that some part of him had been acting out of protection for me, even while betraying me, even while selling my kidney. And tears spilled freely down my cheeks as I struggled to reconcile the duality of the man he had become, the betrayer and the protector, the desperate son and the frightened child. And memories flooded my mind of moments that now took on a new, painful context. The night he had returned home drenched in rain, the way he had avoided my gaze, the hurried phone calls I had never understood, the strange excuses for missing school or work, all now making sense as the survival tactics of a child forced too early to navigate a dangerous adult world. And the weight of that understanding pressed on me, heavy and relentless, because while it explained, it did not excuse. While it softened my anger, it intensified my sorrow, the sorrow of realizing that my son had carried a lifetime of fear and manipulation into the moment of betrayal. And the photographs also revealed moments of tenderness, Glimpses of the boy I had loved, Asher reading a tattered book, alone in a corner, drawing sketches in a notebook, catching a stray cat and feeding it scraps. The fleeting smiles that betrayed innocence and hope despite the darkness surrounding him. And these glimpses of light only made the shadows deeper, because I saw clearly now that the man who sold my kidney had been forged in fire long before he reached adulthood. That every desperate decision, every fearful act, was the echo of a childhood I had only now begun to understand. And as I pieced this together, a new determination rose within me, fierce and unwavering, because I knew that if I could reach that frightened child, the one hidden beneath layers of survival, coercion, and fear, perhaps I could reach the man he had become. Perhaps I could guide him back toward redemption. And yet, fear gnawed at me, because I understood now that the people who had manipulated him were still out there, still waiting, and their reach was long, their influence pervasive, and any misstep could cost us everything. And in the nights that followed, I traced every name, every letter, every photograph, building a map of Asher's past. A map that revealed not just danger, but also the keys to understanding him, to confronting him, to finally healing the fracture in our bond. And each night, I whispered into the darkness, praying that he would understand, praying that he would remember the boy who had once climbed into my lap, who had whispered secrets in the dark, who had loved and feared in equal measure, because that boy, though buried under trauma, still existed. And I had to reach him before it was too late. And as I looked at his childhood drawings, the innocent sketches of family, of trees, of animals, I felt a swell of hope mixed with the ache of grief, because I knew that even in the darkest heart, there is a trace of light, a remnant of innocence. And that light was the only thing that could guide him back. And as I folded the letters, packed the photographs, and steeled myself for the confrontation to come, I realized that my journey had transformed from a quest for vengeance or explanation into something far deeper, a mission to reclaim my son, to heal him, to protect him from the shadows that had haunted him since childhood, and to finally understand, with a mother's heart and a survivor's resolve, that even in the face of unimaginable betrayal and secret horrors, love could still endure, and that the path forward, though perilous and fraught with fear, was one I had to walk, no matter the cost. Because the truth about Asher's past, though painful and devastating, held the key to our future. And I whispered once more, the rain tapping at my window, the shadows of the room pressing close. We will survive, Asher, we will survive. And you will find the boy I once knew, buried beneath the fear and lies, and together we will endure. And in that vow, fragile yet fierce, I felt the first glimmer of hope piercing the darkness, a light that promised that even the deepest betrayal, the most horrifying secrets, could be confronted, and that redemption, though distant, was not impossible. And as I placed the photographs and letters carefully into my bag, ready to confront both Asher and the shadows of his past, I knew, with every fibre of my being, that the next steps would define not only his future but the very essence of our bond, and that what I would uncover next would either shatter us entirely or finally illuminate the path toward healing, understanding, and perhaps, just perhaps, forgiveness. But nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered next, a truth about Asher so dark, so shocking, that it made me question everything about our family and the life we thought we knew. I thought I had seen the worst, but what I discovered next shattered everything. My son's secrets were darker than I ever imagined. No mother should uncover what I found. It changed my life forever. As I sat alone in my dimly lit living room, the envelope of Asher's childhood secrets spread across the worn coffee table, rain tapping against the window, a chill in the air that seemed to echo the cold dread gripping my heart. I realized that what I had uncovered so far, the debts, the coercion, the shadowy figures, the letters from L.R. Whitman, was only the beginning. A surface scratch on the bone of truth, because hidden beneath the trauma of his childhood. beneath the layers of fear and survival instincts that had guided him into selling my kidney, there lay a darker, more horrifying reality that I was only beginning to comprehend. And it came to me as I noticed a small, folded piece of paper tucked in the corner of the folder. One that I had not yet examined, its edges frayed, the ink smudged as if someone had written it in a rush. Perhaps in fear, perhaps in secrecy. And as I unfolded it, my hands trembling so violently that I almost dropped it, I recognized the handwriting immediately. Not Asher's, not Alara's, but someone else, a man named Victor Dane. A name I had encountered fleetingly in the ledgers. One of the shadowy figures who had pressured Asher for money. Yet this note was different, personal, almost intimate in its threat, outlining that Asher's actions, including selling my kidney, were not merely desperate acts but steps in a plan that involved deception, manipulation, and control over our entire family, and the thought that my son had been entwined in something far more sinister than mere debts, that he had been drawn into a web of criminal influence from which escape was almost impossible, made my chest tighten as if a vice had closed around my heart. And I recalled the night I confronted Asher in that dingy apartment above. The shuttered store, the fear in his eyes, the tremor of his hand holding the phone, the way he avoided my gaze, and now I understood, with a gut punch clarity, that the fear I had seen was not only guilt for betraying me, but terror at the enormity of forces he could neither see nor control. Forces that had shaped his actions, dictated his choices, and pulled him into a life that I could barely comprehend. And as I pieced together the photographs, letters, and notes, I saw patterns, dates, repeated threats, encounters that Asher had never mentioned, the strategic manipulations of Victor Dane and his associates, the ways they had tested him, coerced him, bound him to secrecy with fear as their leash, and I shuddered, realizing that my son had been walking on a tightrope over a pit of vipers since childhood, that every choice he had made, every lie he had whispered, had been calculated survival. And yet, despite all that, he had crossed the ultimate line by taking from me the one person who had always loved him unconditionally, and the weight of that betrayal, intertwined with the haunting understanding of his forced circumstances, made my mind reel with conflicting emotions, rage at the criminal forces, sorrow for the child who had been manipulated, and a lingering, reluctant sympathy for the young man trapped between survival and morality. And as I absorbed this, I remembered the nights he had come home late, drenched from rain, with excuses that no longer made sense until now. The phone calls he had hidden, the menacing whispers I had only half heard, all falling into a terrifyingly coherent narrative. One that traced the shadowy tendrils of influence from Elara Whitman to Victor Dane and his network. And the horrifying realization hit me that these people had been grooming him, teaching him deceit and manipulation as tools for survival. And in many ways, the act of selling my kidney was not merely desperation, it was a test, a step in proving his obedience, his cunning, his ability to navigate the dangerous adult world he had been thrust into. And as my tears fell unchecked onto the documents, I felt a mixture of helplessness and determination, because while understanding the root of his actions softened my anger, it did nothing to alleviate the fear, the urgency, the need to protect him, to save him from the men who were still out there, who would not hesitate to destroy him or me if we faltered. And as I thought about confronting these men, plotting a way to extract my son from their influence, I realized the enormity of what lay ahead, the danger, the unpredictability, the constant tension between hope and despair. Yet I could not turn away, because a mother's love does not allow her to retreat in the face of peril. And I resolved, with trembling hands but a resolute heart, to gather every scrap of information, every clue, every fragment of Asher's past and present, to arm myself with knowledge before stepping into the storm. And in the quiet moments, my mind drifted back to his childhood, The boy who had laughed at raindrops, the boy who had once clung to me in fear of thunderstorms, the innocent child who had trusted me completely, and I wept for him. For that boy lost beneath years of fear and manipulation, and for the man who had betrayed me, yet was still my son, the one I had loved beyond reason, beyond logic, beyond endurance. And as I planned my next steps, I felt the first flickers of hope, the thought that perhaps by understanding the depths of his past, I could reach the present, reach him, and guide him back to some semblance of morality. Even as the shadows of Victor Dane's network loomed large, threatening to engulf us both, and the more I dug, the more I uncovered coded messages in notebooks, unexplained transactions in bank statements, names of associates who had been monitoring Asher since he was a child, and it became terrifyingly clear that this was not a single act of desperation, but a prolonged orchestration of control. A system that had ensnared my son long before he could fight. And the knowledge made the betrayal cut even deeper. Because while I now understood, I also realized how deeply powerless I had felt. How helpless I had been to intervene. And yet, amidst the despair, I found a fierce determination. Because knowledge gave me a tool that fear could not strip away. A weapon stronger than rage, understanding, clarity, and the mother's instinct to protect. And I began meticulously documenting everything, creating a map of threats, alliances, dates, and evidence, tracing the path from Asher's childhood trauma through the manipulations of Elara Whitman, the pressures of Victor Dane, the debts, the betrayals, the actions that had culminated in my kidney being sold, and every step illuminated the complexity of the world he had navigated, and the courage it had taken him just to survive. And as I read through old photographs of him as a child, smiling despite everything, I felt both grief and admiration. Grief for the boy who had suffered in silence, admiration for the resilience he had developed, and yet, I knew that admiration alone would not save him. That action was necessary, planning, precision, and a confrontation that would demand every ounce of courage and cunning I possessed. And I realized that the path forward would be treacherous, filled with moral dilemmas, danger, and the constant tension between protecting my son and holding him accountable for his actions. Yet I knew that I could not falter, because surrendering to despair would doom both of us. And so, armed with knowledge of his past, the network that ensnared him, and the methods of control used against him, I began preparing, reaching out quietly to contacts, gathering intelligence, and cautiously formulating a plan that balanced caution and assertiveness. Even as my heart ached with grief, anger, and love, and as night fell, the room dim except for the flickering lamp, I whispered into the darkness. I vow to both myself and Asher, no matter what it takes, we will face the truth, confront the shadows, and reclaim our lives. And in that vow, I felt a flicker of hope piercing the darkness, fragile yet fierce, because I now knew the full extent of the danger, but also the path to redemption. And as I packed the letters, photographs, and notes into my bag, readying myself to confront not only Asher but the men who had manipulated him, I knew that the next steps would define the fate of both my son and myself. That the truth I was about to uncover would either destroy us completely or finally illuminate a way toward justice, understanding, and perhaps forgiveness. And in that moment, I realized that love, though tested beyond reason, would be the compass that guided me through the darkest storm of my life, and that no secret, no betrayal, no shadowy network could extinguish the bond between a mother and her child. And that as I stepped out into the rain-soaked night, heart pounding, mind alert, and spirit unbroken, the story was reaching its climax, and the next revelation, the truth about Asher and the forces that had shaped him, would either shatter us or set us free. But nothing could prepare me for the final revelation, one that would shake the very foundation of our family and force me to make the hardest choice of my life. I thought I had endured everything, but the final truth shook me to my core. The The secret I uncovered about my son changed everything forever. No mother should ever face what I did next. It left me breathless. The night I had prepared for. The night when the culmination of years of fear, betrayal, manipulation, and secrets would finally meet the light of truth, arrived with the storm raging outside my small home. The rain hammering the roof and the wind moaning through the cracks in the windows, mirroring the chaos and trepidation swirling in my chest. And as I sat at the dining table, clutching the collection of letters, photographs, and notes that detailed the twisted web of Asha's past, I realized with a trembling certainty that this night would either bring closure, understanding, and redemption, or destroy the fragile remnants of our family entirely. And I took a deep breath, steadying myself, whispering to the shadows that had haunted us for so long, "We will face it, and we will endure." And then I called Asha, my voice firm but gentle, the words trembling with a mixture of fear and hope, asking him to meet me at the small park where we had once played when he was a child, where the swings had creaked under his small frame and laughter had filled the air. And as he arrived, soaked from the rain, the hood of his jacket clinging to his face, I could see the flicker of fear, guilt, and perhaps recognition of the mother who had never given up on him in his eyes. And we sat on the wet bench, the droplets running down the metal, mixing with the tears that now streaked my face. And I began to speak, slowly, carefully, unraveling the secrets of his past, the manipulation by Elara Whitman, the coercion and threats by Victor Dane, the hidden debts, the pressure, the impossibility of his choices. And with each word, I saw his posture shift, a mixture of shame, relief, and dawning comprehension. And then I brought out the most shocking revelation, the one that had eluded us both until now. The secret I had discovered buried deep in his childhood letters, photographs, and journal entries. The fact that Asha had been coerced into situations that were far darker than I had ever imagined, involving not just financial exploitation but moral corruption, decisions no child should ever face. Decisions that had forced him into a path where survival meant betrayal. And as I explained this to him, his eyes widened, a mixture of horror and understanding. And I saw the boy I had loved, frightened and vulnerable, surfacing through the man who had once sold my kidney. And in that moment, the weight of years of pain and misunderstanding seemed to hang suspended between us, a fragile bridge of truth and reconciliation. And then I revealed the final twist, the revelation that shook me to my core as a mother, that Victor Dane, the figure who had orchestrated so much of Asha's despair and manipulation, had intended to use him for far more than money, that he had been grooming him for acts that could have destroyed not just our family, but many others, and that my son, by surviving, by navigating the impossible, had prevented catastrophes that I could barely comprehend. And as I said this, I saw tears stream down his face, his hands shaking as he covered his mouth, unable to speak. And I reached out, taking his hands in mine, feeling the trembling, the guilt, the fear, the relief, and the fragile hope. And I whispered, "You did not choose this path, Asha, but you survived it. And now, together, we can rebuild. Together, we can heal." And the rain continued to fall around us, the dark clouds above slowly breaking, letting a few slivers of light through. And I realized that even in the deepest betrayal, even in the darkest secrets, there is a chance for redemption, for love to triumph over fear. And as we embraced, the bond between mother and son, tested beyond imagination, began to mend. The years of pain and misunderstanding slowly giving way to understanding. And in that moment, I knew that the journey was far from over, that the healing, the rebuilding, the restoration of trust would take time, patience, and courage. But I also knew that the foundation of love, though shaken, had not been destroyed. And as we stood up from the bench, dripping with rain but lighter in spirit, I felt a clarity and resolve I had not felt in years, a determination to protect him, to guide him, to rebuild what had been fractured, and in the days that followed, we confronted the remaining threats carefully and methodically, using the knowledge I had gathered from the letters, photographs, and documents, and slowly, the shadows that had haunted Asha's life began to dissipate, the web of manipulation and fear loosening its grip. And as we navigated this treacherous path together, I saw him regain his strength, his humanity, his moral compass, and in the quiet moments, when the storm had passed and the sun shone softly through the windows, I realized that survival had been only the beginning, that understanding, forgiveness, and the rebuilding of trust were the true journey, and I documented every step, every revelation, every tear, every confession, both for myself and for others who might one day face similar betrayal. Because there is power in telling the story, in sharing the pain, and in finding hope amidst the heartbreak. And as I write this now, reflecting on the years of fear, betrayal, and ultimate revelation, I feel a profound sense of gratitude for the resilience of the human heart, for the bond between a mother and her child, and for the strength that comes from facing the unimaginable and surviving, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. And as Asha and I continue to rebuild our lives, slowly, cautiously, carefully, I know that the lessons of the past will remain with us, guiding us, shaping us, reminding us of the fragility and the power of love, the consequences of manipulation and betrayal, and the possibility of redemption even in the darkest circumstances. And now, as I close this chapter, as I share this story with the world, I want every mother, every child, every person who has faced unimaginable betrayal to know that survival is possible, that understanding can lead to healing, and that love, though tested beyond reason, can endure. And I urge you, dear viewer, to hold your loved ones close, to speak openly, to forgive where possible, and to never underestimate the power of resilience. Because even in the darkest storm, a flicker of hope can guide you toward light. And if this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to help others hear it, to spread awareness of the struggles some families endure in silence, and to honor the bond between a mother and her child, a bond that, no matter how broken, can be mended with courage, understanding, and unwavering love, because in the end, that is the story I carry in my heart, the story I've survived, and the story I will continue to live every single day.